Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Kevin Roberts Show. This week, we're excited to share a conversation with the cowgirl governor from South Dakota, Kristi Noem. We discuss her journey from ranch life to the governor's mansion and the battles she's led in South Dakota, from tax reform to COVID lockdowns. I hope you enjoy our conversation, and as always, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a 5-star review while you're at it. Well, Governor Noem, thanks again for being here. I'll just give you a reaction from a guy who's new to D.C. and spent some time in Wyoming, which I know is not South Dakota, but you would probably concede similar folks.
Pretty close.
Which is to say, they represent average America. Mm-hmm. And to say average America is a great compliment, because there are people who recognize there's a certain role for government. It's very limited, as you outlined, but this is really the point. You've got the advantage of being the governor of that great state, but also having spent some time, a tour of duty, shall we say, here in D.C. And your book strikes me because you start with the first sentence about something your dad told you, which is that we fix problems, to paraphrase him.
He consistently said, we don't complain about things, we fix them.
That's right. Yep. And so, with that, knowing that things are going well in South Dakota, how in the world do we fix Washington, D.C.?
Oh, my goodness.
Simple question to get us started.
Well, you know, I was always shocked because I served in our state legislature. Our state legislature's only, session is 40 days long. So they're all citizens, they have other jobs, they come in, serve 40 days, they balance the state budget, pass their bills, and they go home. As governor, it's fantastic because for the vast majority of the time, the legislators aren't there. But I was shocked when I got to D.C., coming from being in leadership at the state level to serving in Congress. Within several weeks, I felt like I knew why this place was so broken, and it's because it has no rules. I went to my first committee hearing, and I prepared, read all the documents ahead of time. I sat down in the committee hearing, and it was about to begin, and the staffer came over to me and said, here's the questions that you'll ask today in today's committee. And I said, well, I have my own questions that I'm gonna, they said, no, these are the questions the chairman would like you to ask. And I said, well, no, I actually have questions and they would say, no, the chairman would like you to ask these questions. And I was so shocked by that there was going to be a certain conversation that was trying to be facilitated by the chairman. But I realized within several weeks that a lot of the dysfunction in Washington, D.C. is because there's no rules. I could file a bill out here for 20 years. There's no guarantee it would ever get a hearing, that no one would ever have a discussion on that topic. The only way it would get a hearing is if that chairman decided he wanted to talk about it, or she, and have the conversation. That bill may pass through that committee. It may get overwhelming support, but that doesn't mean it'll ever be voted on the House floor. If it may get on the House floor, but that would be because the Speaker and the Majority Leader decide they want to have that conversation. If the House passes a piece of legislation, a reform, the Senate can completely ignore it. What surprised me was the House even had its own Rules Committee. It could go to the Rules Committee and make up a new rule for every single bill that came to the floor. If they didn't like the rule, they could go change the rule and make a new one. The dysfunction out here does not create open debate. It doesn't create any accountability. At the state level in South Dakota, if you have a bill, it's guaranteed a hearing. If it passes committee within 3 days, it'll be on the House floor for a vote. If it passes the House, it will be scheduled for a hearing in the Senate. That legislative process facilitates open debate and accountability, and issues can't be ignored. So most people don't necessarily always hold to a respect for the legislative process, but if you had that kind of open debate on every topic that was important to the people of this country, I think it would change things. People would have to vote. They'd have to be accountable for how they voted. They wouldn't get to ignore issues that they don't want to talk about, that worked for their political career, and the country would be much better served. That's one example.
Well, it's a great example, and not that it's any surprise, it's just a lot of common sense there, which is in short supply, I've discovered, in the nation's capital. It leads me to this question, which is, do you sense, not just with your hat as governor on, but as you like to say, the cowgirl governor, that Americans kind of across the political spectrum, but especially right of center, know that they've had enough of this, and that as they are prepared in all likelihood to send a conservative majority to DC in the coming months, that they want that conservative majority to govern with a heavier dose of common sense than, say, you experienced when you were a member of the House?
Oh, absolutely. I think most people, when they look at what's happening out here, they don't understand how how it got to the point where it's at today. We need to be able, civil discourse was something that our founders recognized was necessary to preserve our republic. And we don't have that today. Instead, we have leaders that stand up on TV and are more willing to grab a headline than they are to have a sensible policy debate. And that is the destruction of our country happening before our very eyes. And the American public recognizes it. Most people got panicked when parents started showing up at school board meetings. I thought it was fantastic. It was there because there's people that haven't been paying attention to government and politics for many, many years, and they're finally paying attention now. People recognized during the pandemic the influence that bad leadership has on their lives. It mattered who was making those decisions on their businesses, their families, their kids, and now they're paying attention in ways that they never were before. That's a good thing. And that's something that'll make all the difference in the world in this next election cycle.
Sure, and I think to piggyback on that, if you don't mind, that one of your gifts as an elected leader, we were talking about this off stage, I just mean this not to be patronizing at all, but heartfelt, and it's probably because of your upbringing in South Dakota, going back to the average American point, is that you have a wonderful, very deep understanding of policy, but you can communicate that in a way that the average South Dakotan and American understands, not to suggest they aren't smart, but they're doing really smart things like not paying attention to politics. Yeah. And where I'm going with that is that if you're giving advice to people who may hold office here in DC, what are the issues that are really good for conservatives to be leaning into right now? And what would be some messaging lessons that you've learned along the way?
The interesting thing is that by serving here for 8 years, I've got the cell phone numbers of a lot of people who still serve here. So unfortunately, they still get to hear what I think and what some of my advice would be. Just be a normal human being, first of all. I mean, honestly, you can't turn on the TV and feel like any of those people are normal anymore. Talk like a human being to somebody that's your neighbor, the conversation you would have at the gas station or at church on Sunday morning. A lot of people get on TV and think they have to perform. And frankly, I think America's over that. And then focus on what is happening in your community. And you'll watch the national journalists and reporters constantly try to drag political and elected officials down into controversial subjects. Just because they ask you stupid questions doesn't mean you have to answer them. When they ask you a question on a lot of these networks or whatever their agenda they're trying to drive, these elected officials need to remember they should still be answering with what people at home care about. That's what they should be talking about. Glenn Youngkin was a perfect example of this. I thought he did a fantastic job at that. They consistently, every time he got interviewed, tried to drag him into a divisive topic that the people of Virginia weren't concerned about. And he came back to kids. He came back to education. He came back to what the people and the voters in his state cared about, and it made all the difference in the world and him getting enough support to now be the governor.
It's a classic case, and I think that 5, 10, hopefully 50 years down the road, political science courses that look at campaigns and messaging of campaigns will look at Governor Youngkin's campaign, being a new Virginian, I'm very grateful, but they'll also look at what you have done, and thankfully what a lot of conservative governors have done. And it leads me to this question about education. Y'all are doing things right in South Dakota, and in an increasing number of states, we're seeing that happen. We're very encouraged here at Heritage as we prepare to be active in state legislatures on school choice, that this will be the era of every dollar following every child. And yet, as you know better than anyone, the behemoth is right here in Washington, D.C. And so how do we fix the federal stranglehold on education?
Well, it comes down to governors. I do believe. I mean, we could talk about members of Congress eliminating the Department of Education or reforming it to that level, but governors have incredible ability to make a difference right at home. And we empower our school boards. One of the first things that I started to do when I was governor was offer training for our school board members. Many of them, when they come in, it may be a volunteer position in some of these small school districts or something that they're not necessarily recognizing the authority that they have, and by training them so that they actually know the power of the decisions that they make, they're not subjected to just the experience and knowledge of the administrators that are running the building. Many times when they come into their first meeting, they're told by the administrator, well, this is how we've always done it. This is the experts in the field, and without any prior knowledge, that's how they make their decisions. So empowering those school board members is incredibly important. And then letting them know that they don't have to take these federal funds. The federal government is very quick to dictate to our school districts by using money as an incentive. Recently the Biden administration threatened us in South Dakota that if we didn't allow boys to play in girls' sports, they were going to take lunch money away from our school kids. Now, it's so interesting to me that they're pushing their activist agenda so hard, they're willing to create an unfair situation for women and take food away from children. It's shocking to me that they think that works politically or even in day-to-day life, but that's how extreme the left is right now. When I first became governor, one of the very first bills that I ran, that first legislative session, was to put more civics and history in our classrooms, especially at the high school level. That session, my Republicans killed it because they thought it wasn't necessary. They thought it'd be too hard on our administrators to go find new curriculum and our teachers to teach new subject matters, and they killed it. That was in 2019. Now look, just 2 years later, overwhelmingly what's sweeping across the country is the need for more civics and history in our classrooms. And of course, I've gotten their support now, and we've done some great things in South Dakota, but us being proactive and seeing these problems before they're a crisis is incredibly important, and we shouldn't have to argue with ourselves or people who should know better about the importance of dealing with them early rather than waiting until it's already gone out of our classrooms.
It's really that simple. I mean, as you know, and probably a lot of smart policy people in this room, whether they work at Heritage or elsewhere, know there's a lot of studies that back that up, but it goes back to being common sense. So let me ask you two questions about policies from your perspective as a South Dakotan, and then we'll get to audience questions. Sure. The first has to deal with inflation. Mm-hmm. And of course, speaking about academic studies, we know all of the reasons in terms of economics about why inflation happens. But what I'm curious about is for you to let this audience and people who are watching online to know, what's the effect of this ridiculous federal spending on a state that's very well run, that simply doesn't want that level of involvement from the federal government? How do you handle that?
I would say that we definitely are better off than a lot of other states because of the decisions we're making, because we are in a good financial situation. We're not in where we have to increase taxes to fund some of the basic services that government may be responsible for or committed to. But our people are still affected dramatically by the policies that this administration is taking. I would say, for us in South Dakota, we grow your food. Agriculture is our number one industry. Tourism is number two. So when you have bad energy policy that drives up energy costs, that hits a state like ours very hard. I tell people it's consistently cold in the winter and it's hot in the summer in our state, and it is a long ways to drive anywhere. We are a high energy demand state, and when you increase energy costs on a state like ours, for instance, one farmer to run their tractor now a week is another $5,000 to $7,000 per week more than it was just a year ago. So when you start talking about our farm, which would have 6, 7, 8 tractors running every week, the amount of cost just for one operation that obviously is going to be passed on to consumers at the end of the line, you can understand why food costs are higher. And many times we don't even control our own supply chains. The fertilizer, many of those companies are owned by countries such as China. Chemical companies, our processing systems. If you remember during the pandemic, they talked about my meat processing plant that was a hot spot. That's a Chinese-owned facility. Extremely difficult to work with and not my favorite people in the world. We had some very heated, hard and difficult times during that, but now China is buying up hundreds of thousands of acres of land across the country as well. They will control us when they control our food supply. I tell people all the time, they're not dummies. They're not just gearing up and strengthening their military and manipulating currency and stealing our IP. They're also slowly going after our food supply, and that's truly when they control us. So all of this inflation and this bad economic policy allows other countries to strengthen themselves and weakens America, and it will have long-lasting effects on us. So it's the family at home and what they can't pay for that they could pay for a year ago, but also it has a long-lasting effect in how much it weakens America for the next decade or so, or even in the long term when it strengthens our enemies.
Well, you did me a favor because I wanted to ask you about China, Chinese Communist Party and the land. And so I'm going to move on to, I'm going to cheat a little bit here and ask sort of a third policy area, which is about the lockdowns, and then we'll get to audience questions. And you said you were willing to field any questions, so here it is. Dr. Fauci sitting right here with us. What do you tell him?
Well, I saw him running around. I would tell him a lot, and I did actually. I saw him for years running around with Pelosi and the liberals. So from the very beginning, when he was given a platform to be an expert in this area, the warning signs that he would turn this into a political agenda were there. He's been wrong on everything. I mean, we had, most people don't realize governors were on conference calls with each other, with Fauci, with Birx, with the White House task force, with supposed experts, talking and having many hours and hours and hours of conversation throughout the pandemic. Fauci's a liar. He was lying from the very beginning. He knew he wasn't following the data and the science. He had an agenda from day one. If you saw, I guess he just recently came out and told us masks don't work now. And dear God, I feel like I'm, the man's bipolar, and how many times he's gone back and forth on these issues. So, he out of anybody in this country should never be given 1 minute of airtime ever again for the devastation that he has wreaked on so many families. He has wiped out their livelihoods. He's destroyed kids' education. We have kids that forever will struggle because they've been forced to wear masks that has hurt their development. It is a tragedy what that man was allowed to do to the United States of America.
So true. So true. Something told me you wouldn't disappoint.
Oh, I'm sorry.
In your answer to that question. Yeah. Well done. Well done. Well, we do have a little bit of time for a handful of questions before we wrap up and the governor signs some books. So you know the rules here. There's a microphone coming around. Just raise your hand. We'll get to as many of you as possible. And you help us do that if you are as succinct as possible. So first question here, sir.
Hi, my name's Jed Fisher. Agriculture is close to my heart. My home state is Utah. And you mentioned about food being a national security issue. What is your vision for us reaching food security in the United States, and what do you see the state's role and the federal government's role in that vision?
Well, it should be in America's best interest that we have a diversified food supply in the United States. And the reason it should be diversified and not controlled by one entity is so that it can always be competitive, and that you are constantly, having that competition in what we are growing and who owns it, so that you don't have one person controlling the entire food supply, that it's safe that way, and that it also is affordable for every family on the grocery store. When they go shopping, you don't want to have to see a $12 loaf of bread or an $18 gallon of milk. And the reason that we've always consistently approached our food policy that way was to keep it available to every single family in this country that they could feed themselves. So for me, it would, again, it's not difficult if you have a foundation you start from. I tell people all the time, my job as governor, since I've been governor, the last 3.5 years wasn't difficult if you have a foundation. If you start with the Constitution and what authority I have and what my role is, it's not hard to make all your decisions based off of that. Our food policy should come from that same type of foundation, that it should be controlled in America, that it should be diversified, that we shouldn't have one company or one entity owning up all the land and all the processing systems, and that every consumer should have access to it. And then you keep that competition in that market to make sure that it is going to be a safe and affordable food supply. Based on that, anytime we empower a foreign country to come in and buy up those processing systems or our land is when we're going to lose control of it. And it's in our best interest to not allow that to happen.
Thanks for the question, for your response. Fair treatment. I was going to go to this side. Okay, sir, right here in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, Governor Noem. Thanks for being here. You talked a little bit about federal funds being sent to states, and sometimes it's for money that we don't really want. What can we do about Democrats funding like abortifacients like Plan B? And why are my tax dollars going to that when I'm not necessarily supporting that?
So you're talking about, you said Plan B, are you talking about abortion funding?
Abortion funding
Yes,
and abortive
okay.
actions like Plan B, yeah.
Well, the Hyde Amendment has always ensured that we didn't use federal dollars to fund abortions at the federal level, and that's something that I've always supported. I would hope we could continue to maintain, but we've seen that threatened just recently again, and Democrats pushing to have that type of funding available across the country from the federal government. You know, that's a policy debate that many times you saw slipped into bigger bills that many times forced people to make a tough choice on if they were going to fund the government or fund our military or fund our police officers, and then have that provision and put in there as well. So this is something I know the Heritage Foundation's worked on over the years, and many other conservative groups, on having limited subject bills so that you didn't end up having a bill that had 20 different topics where people were forced to fund abortions while they were funding something that truly was the role of the federal government. But for us, anytime you have an elected official in an office, they have influence. What they say matters. The relationships that they have matter. The one advice I would give to everybody in the room too is that we talk a lot in this country about your education, how important it is. You know, how your resume and developing that out is important for your future. I would say the world still moves on relationships. And if you know that at all, it happens up here in Washington, D.C. more than ever. So when it comes to an issue that people may be passionate about, such as protecting life, like I am, I look for every opportunity to defend life in my role as an elected official, but I also build relationships that I know that allow me to advocate for that in different ways that most people don't think of. And I even put somebody in my office that has a job description of being an unborn child advocate. That means that person gets up every single day and they look for opportunities in law, in regulation, and in the court system to defend life. And that's what they do. So many times when we are leaders, you may feel like, well, I'm not a congressman, I'm not yet, or a U.S. senator yet, but you still have the ability to use relationships that you have to talk to people about the importance of federal funds not funding something like that, because it's not an appropriate use of those federal dollars.
I think that comment sparked the desire of a lot of our audience, which is decidedly young, Governor. I've noticed
Yes.
that. It's great encouragement. So yes, public service. Next question, though. Nope, we'll go here. Yeah.
Hi, Governor Noem. I'm William Cady from the Osgood Center for International Studies. So often in my field, I see with some of my liberal partners such a mass movement to provide humanitarian assistance in, for example, Ukraine or different parts of Africa. But in my short time this summer in D.C., I walk around our streets and I see poverty, huge poverty all around our streets. How do we get to liberal voters that are fringe voters to realize the fallacy in that entire situation?
You know, this will be a little bit, you'll think this is off topic, but it's not. When I married into my husband's family, the vast majority of them were Democrats. So then I took their name and I ran for Congress as a Republican. So you can imagine how much they loved me. But you know, many of them have re-registered now as Republicans. In fact, I would say, I tease my mother-in-law all the time that she'll say something, I'll say, Sharon, you sound like a crazy Tea Party Republican now. It's amazing. But and that change did not happen because I blew them up at the Thanksgiving Day dinner table. It just didn't. It happened because we loved each other. We built relationships. We had conversations, and eventually they saw I was right. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
It's really simple.
It's really simple. No, but I think that's what we've seen break down in our society, is that nobody talks to each other anymore. We've gotten offended by each other, and we've quit talking to each other. So I would encourage you to start having conversations with people that you haven't had before. We avoid conversations because we don't want it to be difficult or uncomfortable, but start by listening. Ask people questions and listen, and then have a relationship first, so that you really can have a civil debate and discussion on the policy. And that's how you make a big difference to those folks right there. And that of times, that contrast can be made with Yes, it's a horrific tragedy that we're seeing in Ukraine. It really is. It's awful. But look at this tragic situation we have right here on our front doorstep, and let's go see what we can do there today about that as well. Many times I would say I ask the question almost every single day of somebody, is that a job that the government should be doing in your life? Or is that a job that you should be doing? Or is that a job that your church should be doing? Or a nonprofit should be doing? So many times it's what is that a proper role for the government is the best conversation to be asking people when they're complaining about something that needs to be addressed.
Well, I was going to try to squeeze in one more audience question, but looking at the clock, I know that you want to sign some books and meet some people. And so I'm going to ask this last question on behalf of everyone in the audience. Last line in the book, last paragraph of the book.
Should have read the book recently. I'm trying to remember what my last line was.
I did my homework, Governor. I did not want to be in trouble. And your dad looms large in the book because your dad loomed large in your life. And it's on those grounds alone, you need to read the book. But you talk about something those of us who reach a certain age think about with loved ones who've moved on to the next life. So this is about your dad, imagining for those of us who ride horses, you get another horse ride with him. I don't know for sure, you're right, but I can imagine him saying something like this. There's a lot that needs fixing still, and we're burning daylight. But it will be a better day tomorrow. For America, in spite of all of the challenges, thinking about the themes and all of these questions, why is the future still bright?
I think for the first time in a very long time, we've got proof that what we believe as conservatives works. The pandemic gave us a unique opportunity to really show that leadership had consequences, and it made all the difference in the world. So we've talked about as Republicans or conservatives or however you affiliate about, well, we believe this. We believe in these economic principles. We believe in limited government. We actually, during the pandemic, had the chance to look from state to state and see where those types of decisions had a dramatic effect on people's lives. And we know now and have the proof that what we believe works. That's a great opportunity for us to bring hope to people and to show them that America's brightest days, I believe, are still ahead, that people are happier when they're free, and that it's a great time for us to recenter on our foundational principles and the gift that those men and women who sacrificed such great things to give us this country did. It really was a great experiment, but my goodness, it's still the most amazing country in the entire world. So it's worth getting up every single day and deciding to be happy. We got a lot of people that have forgotten how blessed we are to live here. So let's wake up and be happy and make sure we're bringing that hope.
Excellent response. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of The Kevin Roberts Show. I certainly hope you enjoyed that conversation with Governor Kristi Noem. Stay tuned next week for another insightful guest. Thanks, y'all.